Welcome to Threads of Enlightenment, and it is my honor and pleasure to welcome our guests. As always, I know that once they present, they are bringing several things that are very precious. First of all, their time. It is a precious commodity by which we are able to move within this space called life. And I truly thank you for the time and for your gift of your time. Second, I want to thank you for your journey because you are now trusting us with your information, your pain, your sacrifices, your triumphs. And it is my hope that I create a space by which you feel comfortable and home. Madison, thank you for coming to Threads of Enlightenment. I deeply appreciate your presence.
I deeply appreciate being here.
Thank you so much. Tell the people a little about yourself, the things that you have created, that you have given birth as a result of your journey.
I am a practitioner of Ayurvedic medicine. I have a clinic here in Austin, Texas, that I see people in various capacities through women's health, through nutrition, herbology, Panchakarma, detoxification, childbirth, all sorts of different things. I have practiced and studied yoga for over a decade, not yoga as an asana practice, but as a spiritual practice, and that infuses everything that I do. And I am a sustainability advocate. I spend a lot of my time right now working in the realm of environmental sustainability and education. And from my perspective, health and the environment are two sides of the same coin. What keeps us healthy also keeps the earth healthy, and we are made from the elements of nature. And so I feel a duty to help us all remember that we are nature, and vice versa.
That is awesome, and I love the fact that you mentioned to help us remember that we are from nature, and it is absolutely true, because this house that we are in, the material that is made from it, they find all of that within nature. And so it is, I love how you place that. So what we do here at Threads is to go back. We want to, I call it the lab in Madison, but people call it family. In this lab, we have these scientists that are called our parents, and they are just putting this wonderful thesis that they have acquired from their college days with their mom and dad and grandfathers and all their friends and all that stuff. They're just putting this together to begin to impart their wisdom and even some of their, I would say, some of their things that they did not learn that they needed to release, and sometimes it manifests in their life in all different forms. Talk to us about your family. What was your lab like?
My lab was fascinating, as is everyone else's. I grew up with a mother and a father who were divorced when I was 4 years old. My father is from the Midwest. My family's from the Midwest, both of them, from Detroit, Michigan, and Cleveland, Ohio. Nice. And my mother was a incredibly intuitive, deeply, I want to say we're all spiritual, but deeply aware of her spirituality. Yes. And had a lot of trauma growing up in her family. She grew up with an alcoholic father, a emotionally constrained mother, the oldest girl of 7 siblings, and physically and emotionally abused by some of her siblings. And so she grew up with a deep anger towards what I these days call the masculine energy in the world. Yeah. And she would call it men, right? And she was fiery and charismatic, but, tough to maintain relationship with. And I grew up mostly with her, and my father I saw on the weekends, and he's a very good-hearted man. Struggled with communication. When I was young, I was an insomniac by the time I was 9. I had took Tylenol PM to go to sleep, and had 9 years old. I had all sorts of seemingly unrelated health issues that nobody knew what to do with. And, as an adult, as I went through my healing journey, I came to recognize the interconnection between my physical, mental, emotional, and environmental realm that I experienced both inside of me and around me. And when I was 16 years old, I ran away from home. I was a teenage runaway, and my mother told me that she was a prostitute when I was 11 years old. She had turned to this type of work as a single mother, and as an adult, I have a much more depthful understanding of it than I did as a teenager. And did all sorts of other odd jobs. I grew up on food stamps and all sorts of different types of support and poverty, and but also my mother gave me tremendous opportunity and inspiration. She always tried to see and utilize the gifts that she saw in me, and so she always found a way to find opportunity that was beyond our social economic class, right? So I would often go to school outside of the district that we lived in, and I would get scholarships to this, that, and the other thing. And I got went to an art school that I was a dance major in, and had all sorts of amazing opportunities and experiences in my life because she prioritized that. So my lab was a fascinating one. It was a beautiful one. Was a challenging one.
Yeah. So how being a part of a divorced family, because I know when I was going through my divorce, I made it a priority to walk with my children. I held their hands and talked with them to explain what was happening, because I had some understanding that I didn't want them to internalize a decision that was made between their mom and I. And so I invested much to make sure that that was not the case. How did that movement of your family, the security of your family, I know you were young, how did that impact you when you were mingling with both of these different personalities on their different areas? Because when you're together, you behave different. But when you're separated and you're living separately, there's different energies. How did you manage being at one and the other as time goes on?
That's a good question. When I was young, I felt like it was pretty fluid, right? It was just the reality. It was just what I did.
Yes.
I went to my dad's on the weekends, and I was with my mom during the week. And as time went on, I realized that I had digested many of their opinions of one another, that I had absorbed, those feelings, those energetics. And so my mother would complain about my father's communication skills or his emotional availability or his, blah, blah, blah. And my father would stay largely silent, but I feel his distraught quality when it came to the relationship with my mother. And so I felt the disconnect. And so it felt like two different worlds that I was in. And I developed asthma, which interestingly is very connected to children that experience divorced families.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there were several other things, but I felt I enjoyed being with my dad on the weekends, and I would often come home sick, and my mother would blame it on him that he wasn't feeding me right or something or another, right? So the divisiveness between two parents, which I understand now as an adult, is very common, for children to experience. But I will say that I remember when I was in elementary school, there was a club for children who had experienced divorced parents, and they wanted me to go, and I rejected the invitation because I said, my parents are best friends. There's nothing wrong with me. I don't need to do that. right? And that was far from the truth. And of course, they did a wonderful job. They did their best to try to create an inclusive environment, loving environment, and all of that. But my father had a quadruple bypass when he was 38 years old that he attributes to the stress that he experienced in the marriage.
That is I'm sorry, I'm laughing. I shouldn't be, but I think it's funny. Let me walk with you a little as to what was the incident that caused you to run away, to leave, and go on your own. What was that? How did it affect you to the point where it drove you to go on your own? What entered in, what situation that ushered in that aspect of your decision process?
Well, as I became a teenager in my home, which was largely with my mother at this time, things grew increasingly more volatile between us. She was very, from a psychological perspective, which is not how I would define her, but from a psychological perspective, she was what we would call borderline personality. And as I became more autonomous and more, I'd question things, I'd talk back, I had more spunk and, all those things. Things became increasingly volatile between us. Yeah. And I had my first boyfriend when I was 16, and that was welcome on the surface, but deep down it was very threatening to her. And so I found myself running away sometimes, but I'd come back. And then I found myself looking over the edge of the balcony. We lived in an apartment building, and I became more and more afraid of my own self, my own emotions, my own turbulence, my own instability, and afraid of the violence that I experienced, the emotional violence that I experienced in my home and in myself. And I hit a breaking point. We got in, I don't even remember what it was, but we got in some fight, and I hit a breaking point that I was afraid of coming home because of that intensity of that emotional violence that I felt. And so at the time, as an emotionally volatile 16-year-old who didn't feel like I had anywhere to go, I felt like my relationship with my mother was really all I had, other than I had a boyfriend at the time. I decided that I was going to commit suicide. And so I wrote a suicide note, and I left it at my mother's apartment, and I drove and I went to a convenience store that I was going to, my plan, which was not very well thought out. It really was more of a call for help than it was a reality. But as you know, at the time, my plan was to go and get some pain, a couple bottles of painkillers and take them. And then I called my boyfriend, his name was Zach at the time, and I shared with him what I was going through. And my friend Zach went around the city and drove around until they found my car in Denver, Colorado. And they took me to his mother's house, and they sat me down and they talked for a long time and calmed me down, and they drove me down to my father's house about an hour and a half south in Colorado Springs. And a couple of days later, the police came after me because I had left a suicide note with their guns raised at my father's house, and because there was a potential suicide victim inside the house, and that was a huge turning point in my life, in so many ways. It started a completely different path for me, an exploration for me, and I went to therapy. I remember going to the police. I made a deal with the police at that time, because, looking into and understanding the cycle of violence and the cycle of youth, homelessness and violence and things like that, I understand that could have been a huge turning point for me. I could have ended up on the streets. I could have ended up in all sorts of different scenarios. And at the time, I had a very candid conversation with police officers. And I shared with them what I was going through and what I was doing and why. And they, instead of taking me to what they call psychological evaluation after this episode, which often leads to various other steps in this cycle, they said, you know what, we're not going to do that, Madison, but we need you to promise us that you'll go to therapy by Monday.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, okay, I will. I'll go to therapy by Monday, I promise.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did. And that was, I would say that was the beginning of my healing journey that, went on for, still present today. But that was a big turning point for me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I tell people, Madison, that life is a series of agreements that we make with ourselves. You were in your situation and you made an agreement. And once we make our agreement, and I call it the statement of faith. And the reason why I say that is because we believe it more than anything else. The outside world doesn't believe it because we made that statement and we believed it so much that we will implement the corresponding actions to make it come to pass. And you see that with your decision that you made. But then when you got into that space and you made the promise to the police officers, tell me about that other agreement, because you need something in order as you began to peel things away from the being with the person to help guide you by asking the questions. And that's I call them guides. All they simply do is ask you questions that you are not aware of to ask yourself. And so when they begin to ask those questions, you begin to, it kind of, first of all, it'll pull you into the current space that you're in. And then you begin to investigate as to what emotion was that? Why did I do that? Because you've never thought about it. As that person began to ask you those questions, first tell me of some of those things that you noticed that you had given permission to become monsters in your life. And then tell me about that agreement that you made from there to guide you through your development.
The first thing that comes to my mind is at that time, obviously that was a very low, it felt like a very dense, low time.
Yeah.
And I remember writing in my journal as this, 16-year-old.
Yeah.
And I remember writing about how I didn't feel like I had any value to live, right? And that I was just making everybody's life harder and more painful. Yeah. And so when you say, what were those monsters? That's the first thing that comes to mind, right? It was those thought barricades of feeling valueless and like I was just creating more harm, being alive, right? And so what I ended up doing is I ended up writing in my journal, and I started to write a list of all the people that I wanted to say goodbye to. And I thought there was going to be a list of maybe 5 people, right? That, I would need to say goodbye to, because I left kind of suicidal, but those feelings that produced that action didn't go away because you're right. So I started to write this list, and thinking it was going to be about 5 people. It went on and on and on, and it ended up being like a 3-page list of all of these people that I cared about and who cared about me.
Yeah.
And I remember getting kind of including that and looking at it and it just being so profound.
Yeah.
And, now I understand that the sense or the feeling of isolation and loneliness contributes monumentally to, the experiences and actions that we take in that way. And then conversely, the experience of connection is what makes us feel safe and heard and, valued and things like that. And connection with another person, but also connection to our own soul or connection to the divine, right? But that was a profound experience, that really changed my trajectory.
That is awesome that you had
help
the
me
chance
face
to write
that
it
monster.
Yeah, because I think what it is, the opinion of people that we care about carry tremendous amount of weight, and they usually do attach to our emotions that will ignite hurt, pain, all kinds of other things that it can give birth to. And as we allow, because a lot of us are not aware of how unaware that we are, and it's really interesting to see as you begin your journey, you realize most people are living in a state of unawareness, and the power it resides in a state of living in the awareness. But as those emotional those emotional impact or bombs that are grenade that just being tossed all the time. And I tell people that they become strongholds in our life. And that's all I could think of it as, like a fort that is so fortified that we are able to protect it. And anyone comes close to that thing, we will shoot, kill, do whatever we can to protect. But when we have someone that we have allowed into our camp, into that fortress, that will begin to ask us some questions and make us look at why do we have this wall this high? Why is this here? That I think we began to dismantle some of those things, and it is a powerful tool that you utilize by putting those names of those persons, because those names made you go inside and think as to why. And as you began to think, I believe you began to start awakening up things because your reasoning began to wake as you're putting these pages of names. And then that realization comes and say, wait a minute, there is more for me than those that are against me. And so you begin to change your perspective. What was that? What did you say to yourself at that space right there? Because that is a powerful place to be with all those pages. What was that statement that you made when you realized what you realized?
That I was loved and that I was capable of loving.
That's powerful stuff right there. And as you began to move, Madison, and you realize that you are capable of loving, talk to me about your journey, because it continues, and it'll continue. And I tell people, your journey, your awakening happens, but your journey is continuing. It is until you die. The awakening happens, and that awakes and brings us into the awareness, but then the journey continues. Talk to me as you began to look at this young girl, and how did you start to love her?
Oh, what a journey, right? So many layers.
Yeah.
It was, years later, I described it as an onion peel, right? Each layer of the onion peels, and there's another layer, and then another layer. And as you get closer to the center, it gets more like intense and stinky, and, makes you cry even more.
It's messy but beautiful, isn't it?
Messy but beautiful, yes. So, there's many paths that I could go to answer that question, but one which relates to how I got here and what I do today is my health journey. So I mentioned that I had all sorts of semen-related health issues that no really knew to do with, starting as a very young person. Those continued as a teenager. And by the time I was about 19 years old, I was on about 9 different pharmaceutical medications. Each one seemed to lead to another one that led to a side effect that led to another medication. And I was in college at that time. I was working with the disability service at my college, and I felt like I was getting sicker and sicker. And I had pretty much resolved that I would not live to be 30, that I was dying. And one day, my sister, she got me a gift certificate to a craniosacral session. And I don't know if you know what craniosacral therapy is.
I've been there.
And I had no idea what it was. And so I went. I was this kind of sheepish 19-year-old walking into this therapist's, office. And I was in chronic pain, and I had all sorts of, bizarre things that people usually, don't think of until you're in your 50s, 60s, 70s year old. I'm feeling all of this. And this woman does this session on me, and I was kind of expecting like a massage or something. And if you know craniosacral therapy, you know that it's very subtle. And so it didn't feel like anything was happening, right? And, but she had hands up. First thing is that was very powerful is she was doing some inter-mouth work with me, like working the jaw. She had a glove on, and she went right into my mouth. And what a novel experience that was as a 19-year-old. And I remember her saying, "Who in your life has been suppressing your voice?" And I didn't know what to say or how to answer that question at the time, but it stimulated the awareness, the self-awareness that my voice had been suppressed, that not that somebody had done it to me, right? But that I had a suppressed voice. Yeah. And that my expression was not candid, was not authentic, right? Mm-hmm. And so that was a years and years and years journey to figure out how to express myself, and, in yoga, how to open the fifth chakra, right? And so that was a beautiful journey on itself. And then the other thing that happened is she had her hands on my neck and, wasn't doing anything, but it felt like she wasn't doing anything. And all of a sudden I felt this surge of something to my brain. And I said, "Whoa, what was that?" And she said, she was very, soft spoken. And she said, "Oh, that was your cerebral spinal fluid entering your brain correctly. It's been constricted for a really long time." And I was like, "Wow, that was interesting." And so then I remember driving home that day, and it was almost as if the world had more color. Like, it had more color. Right. And I got home, and I remember looking down at my pharmacopoeia of pharmaceutical drugs that were on my countertop. And I just had this aha moment that was like, "Okay, Madison, it's time for you to take responsibility for your health." And that was a big moment. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, that was a big moment, because until that time, I had been relying on doctors, on parents, on to, tell me what was wrong with me and how to deal with it, right? And so I was like, okay, the first thing I want to do is I want to get off of all these drugs. And so I started going to doctors and asking them if they could help me, and I didn't get a whole lot of support, and so I started just doing it myself. Started to figure out how to do it myself. And it was very hard. Some of them were very hard. And then the next thing I wanted to do is I decided that I wanted to change my diet, because I felt like my diet, that food was potentially medicine, and I wanted to use it. And so I started to learn about food. And that took me on a phenomenal journey, because who knew what a just charged and primal and spiritual thing food is in all of our lives. And so I learned about agriculture and farming and nutrition, and then got into yoga, and that eventually led me to Ayurveda, and it eventually led me to a yogi, in which I spent about 10 years studying very closely with. And that flipped my life upside down in so many different ways. And that led me to Ayurveda, and I studied Ayurvedic medicine. And through yoga and Ayurveda, I was able to heal all of these seemingly unhealable conditions that I was told that I was going to be on medication for the rest of my life. And then through that journey, it was so inspiring and so empowering that I was able to remember part of who I was.
Wow.
And that was that. It's funny you ask about the early days, the lab, right? When I was about 5-6 years old, I knew that I was a healer. I knew that I had a special power in me. And I used to, at family reunions, I used to line up my family, and they'd sign up for sessions, and I'd line up my family, and each one of them would come in, and I'd give them a healing session. And I could tell. I didn't know how I could tell, but I knew exactly where they were hurting. I knew exactly how to touch them to help their pain subside and things like that. But I had forgotten that about myself. Not that I had totally forgotten it, but I had pushed it aside.
Put it aside.
In order to be good in school and to, go to college and fit into kind of the normal American style.
To hook back in.
So the journey of my own healing actually reminded me of a gift that I have and have always had, and inspired me to let that be a part of how I serve the world around me.
I think it is why we go on the journey. I think everyone that comes, I believe we have an agreement. People say the higher power, God. I think in my religion, I grew up as God. And so we have a spiritual agreement because there's a scripture that says, before you were in your mom's womb, I knew you. So that means that we were in existence before we hit the womb. So then we must have had an agreement, a spiritual agreement to come. And I believe we came with gifts. We came with all of these things. As when my sons were young, I would tell them, lay down and picture you have multi-million dollars coming every minute. What would you do? And of course, they talk about the cars and all the other things. And I said, no. Mm-hmm. Tell me, what would you do after you bought all the cars? And here these little boys would start pinpointing things. And I am watching them today do the things. And my youngest is 35, and they were young men when we had this conversation. And there you were. I believe we all have it, and you reconnected with it. But I mentioned to you, I started this conversation and I said, life is a series of agreements that we made. You made the agreement that after you came out from that experience, you said, wait a minute. And you look at all these meds and you say, there is another way. And once you made that agreement, I absolutely believe in my core of core, because that agreement was you and you alone. And it is your belief system. It is your spirit. It comes with such power, that confession, that releasing of your word. And you will do the corresponding action. You will chase it because you want that thing more than anything else. And people will look at you and want to know if you've lost your mind. And I tell people all the time, because I can always pinpoint, Madison, when someone hasn't made that agreement, their life is spinning out of control and they're just drifting. And you said it. You took the initiative to begin to take control of your life. Before that, you were you surrendered it to other people. And the human experience, we surrender it to our 9 to 5. We surrender it to all of these different entities outside of ourselves. And we are afraid to take control of our life and take ownership of it. You took ownership of your life, and your entire life has changed to this day because you made one agreement that I will not, this is it, I'm finished with this. There must be a way. And that's what I tell people. Find your agreement. It is only you. I can't find that for you. I cannot define your agreement. Only you. But when you do, buckle up. And I keep telling them, I said the spirit of the man, or the being, the spirit of the being is waiting for that information so that it can begin to make it happen. Because the Creator, Madison, in us only appears when there's darkness. And it's dying to come out and create, because it wants to show you that you are greater than the sum of all of the medicine, of all of the doctors' input in their study, of all of these things, because the earth, our body, is in partnership with the earth. Your science that you're learning is in partnership. And as you learn that and you initiate it and pair it with the body, combine it will heal that body, because it can't do anything else, but because it's from there. So here you are, this beautiful young girl is blossoming, and she is, if they can see the smile on your face, man, I tell you, they would lose it. So you have gone on your journey. You've experienced some love about yourself. You're growing at this powerful woman, and you had a chance to sit down with some of the Vedas, the teachers, as they say, and you began to learn and input, plant within yourself a beautiful garden, because out of all those conversations are seeds that are being deposited into you that will grow as you begin and need that particular product from those conversations that you had. So talk to me as to when you got into the yoga and all these things, and you're beginning to train your mind, you're training your spirit to deal with all of the circumstances of life. Talk to me as to when you realize, because we have these days of visitation when we realize, holy cow, I'm here, and we look back. Talk to me about one of those days when you sat down in your meditation, or where it was that you had a flashback of that girl that was in pain, and you're seeing where you're at, and that joy that brings that smile on your face that I'm looking at as we're talking.
Well, for a while, I have two things that come to mind in that question. Firstly, every day for my entire childhood up until I was about 20 years old, I would wake up and I would despise my first swallow because I had a sore throat every time I swallowed. And I would wake up and be like, oh, I have to swallow. Oh no, it hurts. And I remember later in my 20s and realizing that for several months or years, I remember that I was waking up and I it didn't hurt to swallow. Yeah. And it just, something as so simple as that was so, it just was so amazing. Yeah. It was just like, oh my gosh, I'm so grateful for this body and this healing journey that I've been on. Like, oh my gosh, it doesn't hurt to swallow. Like, what a funny thing, but it just brought me so much gratitude. Yeah. The other thing that comes to mind is through the years in my time studying yoga very intensively, I had a few what people sometimes refer to as Kundalini experiences or Kundalini rising. Yeah. And I had a few experiences that were pretty profound like that. And those experiences, while are very challenging to express, they, I would say, to sum it up, they each share the experience of feeling a sense of oneness and deep, deep, deep gratitude for all of the experiences that had led me to that moment, all of the people that had been a part of it, all of the natural world around, and reveling in a sense of beauty in all of that, in all of lightness, darkness, pain, pleasure, known, unknown, a real, like, physical sense of gratitude for the beauty of it all. And those experiences were just, I don't even know how to describe how pleasurable they were. Pleasurable on the most deeply cellular level and in the most profoundly broad, energetic level, all at the same time. And that the contrast between that joy and that pleasure and that small, painful, suicidal, fearful girl that I experienced for so long. Not to say that girl isn't still inside of me, because she is, right? Yeah. She is still a part of me. But the contrast between the ability to accept and experience the pleasure and beauty of it all was so different that. Yeah.
I have a theory, and I know sometimes people think I'm nuts, but I think the theory is this. I believe that some of us can be trusted with the awakening. And because there's so many of us, there's 7 billion, I think, maybe a little more, there are a lot of people that can't be trusted with the awakening. And the awakening is for a reason. Once we have gone through that, I mentioned on the onset that we now, as we have gone through, we've peeled away the onions, we've gone into the center of this onion after places were locked away tight that we were able to come through. We then develop these principles by which we govern our behavior. And even the way we speak, we came out of that journey with some stuff. And I believe that some people cannot be trusted, Madison, with the preciousness of that stuff, because what is that stuff for? That stuff is for you and I now to turn around and to become servants to people. Our gift that we have gained, that young girl that felt the power, the healing power in her hand. She was ministering, she was serving her family, touching, relieving pain, changing their energy as she begins to manipulate theirs and bring freedom. Not many people can be trusted. Some of them, I know many of them have gone through ashrams and all this stuff, and they have taken the knowledge and hoarded it to themselves or to their community and not able to deliver that meal to the individual to feed them. And looking at you, I could see that that girl that is within you, that little girl there, even the one that was hurt, she is desperate to go and grab another person and say, wait a minute, you don't have to die. You don't have to. Let me tell you my story. And I'm so excited that you're here to tell this story because it is a precious one. And I am so proud of that girl that was hurt. And she is now this woman that is able to reach and grab another girl and say, let's walk. Let me talk to you for a minute. Let me encourage you. Let me tell you who you are. And as you have learned and trained your mind and you've walked through medicine, how did you, and I know the progression is, but I want to hear you say, how did you navigate once you began to study the Ayurvedic piece and the yoga? How did you branch out and say, this is where I want to live from? Meaning, let me create a space, disconnect from corporate America and all the other places that we associate ourselves, and let me create now this business, this space by which I can be a servant. Talk to me as to how you processed that and how you did it.
You know, you might be surprised by my answer.
What is it?
I began my journey with yoga from a very, I would say, judgmental place of corporate America. I had a deep disdain for corporation, the way we conduct business, and a fear of money and all of those things. And through my journey, I have actually come to a sense of acceptance and compassion for all of the entities and why they are here. And I started, I was very much pushed into starting a clinic by my teacher. I was insecure, and he said, "No, go start it." And so we he pushed me outside of my comfort zone tremendously, and we started our clinic back in Calabasas, California, and then up in Northern California, and then I eventually hit a point that I needed to fly from the ashram, for lack of a better word. Then I needed to. It had become overly. There was some elements that were not healthy within the confines of the group dynamic, and so I needed to fly. And so about a year and a half ago, I actually left this space that had become, what was once tremendously healing and was a lifeline and was incredibly transformative. It became clear that it was time for me to even leave that. And so I picked up in the middle of the night and I left, and I didn't know where I was going. And I ended up in Austin, Texas, in a land that I never thought I would be. I say that I've judged two places in my life, and those were Los Angeles and Texas. And I ended up living in both and being very humbled in both of them. And I ended up back with my husband, my ex-husband, who left the community before I did because he was ready and saw the dynamics, and I wasn't ready to yet. And so I ended up here, and to answer your question, I'm not motivated by money.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I've had to learn to have appreciation for it.
Yes.
I'm motivated by a sense of purpose in my work and a sense of servitude in my, and so that takes many forms these days. Yeah. And when I left and I decided to kind of create a new chapter fairly recently, I decided to sit down and finally write. And I wrote a book. Mm-hmm. I published a book last year called Mind, Body, Food. And then I got to vision how outside of kind of the support that was so supportive at one point, like, Madison, push yourself outside of your comfort zone, and here, do this. Now I have to be that for myself now. Yes. I have to again, that 16-year-old, that 19-year-old, and then that 33-year-old, the cycle comes back to that point. It's just at a different point on the spiral this time, right?
Yes.
And I have to now create even more self-responsibility and creativity and autonomy. But I don't mean autonomy in a way that I'm alone, right? Autonomy in the way that I am an autonomous being, making choices that create my reality. And I find that I make choices from a place of service, from a place of inspiration, then that has a very different path than when I make choices out of self-service or out of fear or XYZ, right? So knowing that very clearly, each moment and each day gives me that choice and gives me that reflection back.
You're sending out, it is two different types of vibration. Fear is a vibration. You can look at it, you can see, I studied sound wave and all of the different things, and it's very fascinating to see the energy and the aurora that comes on the person when they're in fear versus where they're relaxed. And I believe that whatever energy we send out, we receive that back. And when you are in a space, as you stated, where you now have to be mindful of the type of energy that you release in every situation. That's why the journey of self-development is a journey of awareness. You must be aware constantly. You're a guard over everything. And it's really an interesting lifestyle because you have to watch what you say. You have to be mindful of the energy that is around. You have to, all of these things you're taking, and it's a split-second decision. And because of your growth, you're absolutely aware of the split-second decision that needs to take place. And it's really a fascinating thing as you grow. And when you stepped away, you are now even digging deeper to see even more of who you are. And you're going to get to a space 6 months from now, a year from now, where you can look back, my God, I didn't know. And then that's why I say the journey, Madison, is forever. The awakening just happened a few years ago in each and every one of us. But we move through the journey at each state, and we have to be mindful that when we live from this space now that we are in, we cannot live from a space of fear because that did not serve us well. But it can be a fearful place. And it's really interesting. But you have to learn how to transpose and take care of, and I tell people that the thing that you have to be mindful and guard of is your imagination. It is the most powerful thing because the words comes from people and that creates the thought, and the thought enters into the imagination. And once we begin to picture things, we allow fear to come in. We allow all of these negative things or the positive. So as we guard our imagination, because the imagination then will enter into the mind, and the mind, the playground of the mind, becomes a dance where unbelief and fearfulness and worry and all that stuff will go nuts. But if you allow in your mind and your vision, your imagination, you look and see what you want and you pull it, it must come. It is who we are. I am listening to you, and I cannot say how much I am so proud of you. I'm listening to your story, and I'm like just losing it as to this woman that is in front of me. I am so proud of what you have accomplished, and I am so proud of what you are going to do, because I can sense within you that there is much, much more that needs to come forth from you. Everyone that has been listening to Madison and I, get her books, buy those books, and I tell you all the time, my audience knows it, that when you purchase a book and you're reading that book, you are having a one-on-one conversation with the author. Get your cup of coffee or tea, sit down in your safe space, and have that author speak to you. And Madison has a lot to say. She found her voice, and she is speaking to you and calling you to have a conversation with her. Purchase her book and go sit down and have that conversation with her. Madison, thank you for coming to Threads of Enlightenment. This has been pleasurable.
It has been beautiful. Thank you, Ken, for hosting and sharing such a honest and intimate and lovely conversation.
Thank you.